Good afternoon and welcome to the inaugural Bill Gaventa Lecture sponsored by the Institute for Theology and Disability. My name is Kathy Dixon, and as a representative of the Institute's Core Council, we welcome all of you to this virtual event today during the week when we might typically be gathered in person for the Institute. We are all hopeful, I know, that we might be able to gather in person in 2022. Before we introduce Bill, just a couple of quick notes regarding today's format. You can access subtitles or a full live transcript by selecting Live Transcript or at the bottom of your Zoom toolbar with the letters CC for closed captioning. Simply select that button and set your preferences. We ask that you put any of your questions that arise during Bill's talk in the Q&A box, and we will have a moderated Q&A session at the end of his talk. The chat box will be open for conversation, but won't be actively monitored during the Q&A time. A special thank you to our ASL interpreters from Howland Ross Interpreters in Ohio, and to Liz Boyer from MTSO for helping with tech today. Now to get on to introducing Bill, I welcome the one and only Reverend Professor John Swinton, Professor in Practical Theology and Pastoral Care and Chair in Religious Studies, Divinity and Religious Studies at the University of Aberdeen. He is the founder of the University of Aberdeen Center for Spirituality, Health, and Disability, and has been on the faculty for the Institute since its very beginning. So to you, John.
Thank you, Kathy. Well, first of all, it's a real privilege to be here and to be able to be a part of what's a very special night for us in this Bill Gaventa Lecture. But before I introduce Bill, let me just give you a sense of the context for the lecture. So, lecture is done in the spirit of the first decade of the Institute of Theology and Disability, which was founded by Bill Gaventa in 2010. So this new annual Institute lecture, which is called the Bill Gaventa Lecture, highlights the way in which theology and disability intersect with other disciplines and perspectives. So these intersections provide rich opportunities to illuminate, complement, and advance scholarship and practice at the intersections of disability and theology. So the Institute welcomes and respects difference and diversity, bringing together disabled and non-disabled people from varied professions and personal experiences from across faith traditions. So this plenary developed to honour Bill's legacy, where the Institute seeks to enhance participants' capacity to engage with diverse disciplines and a perspective on disability. So that's the background to the lecture. But it's a great pleasure for me personally to be able to introduce Bill Gaventa, who has done some fantastic work in the area of disability and theology over a long period of time. And he, as well as being somebody who's a dynamo, who is able to network everybody across the whole field, he's a good person and a good friend. And so it's my great honor to introduce Bill Gaventa to do the first Bill Gaventa Lecture. Bill, over to you.
Thank you, John. I appreciate it. And thank you, Kathy, and everybody who's put work into this. Hold on just a second. I will be with you in a minute. I'm trying to do something that I hadn't anticipated doing. Okay, now we're okay. All right, sorry about that. During the spring semester of my junior year in college in 1989, a Roman Catholic monk was having a revelatory moment in downtown Louisville, which was my hometown at the time. In Louisville, at this plaque reads, "At Louisville, at the corner of 4th and Walnut, in the center of the shopping district, I was suddenly overwhelmed with the realization that I loved all these people, that they were mine and I theirs, and that we could not be alien to one another, even though we were total strangers. It was like waking from a dream of separateness, of spurious self-isolation in a special world, the world of renunciation and supposed holiness. This sense of liberation from an illusory difference was such a relief and such a joy to me that I almost laughed out loud. I had the immense joy of being man, a member of the race in which God himself became incarnate, as if the sparrows and the sorrows and the stupidities of the human condition could overwhelm me. Now I realize what we all are. If only everybody could realize this, but it cannot be explained. There's no way of telling people that they are all walking around shining like the sun." Thomas Merton, 1968. Intersections. Our paths are always crossing others. You have to do so to get where you want to go. They're always a bit risky. Going through or across them bears the promise of a journey, but also the risk of an encounter you had expected or not expected, for good or for ill. At a conference in Merging Two Worlds in Rochester, another conference focused on intersection of two worlds, another home on my journey, Parker Palmer looked at the audience and said, "I see individuals, but even more so, I see people who are the results of multiple intersections." I don't know about you, but my life and journey have been full of all kinds of intersections. Think about some of yours as I summarize some of mine. Other countries and cultures. As a young toddler, moved from the United States to the rainforest of Nigeria, where my parents were Southern Baptist missionaries, and back to the US twice before returning for the final time just before my junior year in high school. An intersection and journey that was first a journey to a foreign land. "Aren't you glad to be going home?" my Nigerian friend said. But I was far more at home in Nigeria than in a new city, in a new high school about 30 times bigger than the school I'd been in for 3 previous years in Nigeria, one where I could easily deal with the curriculum, but felt like a complete failure at the hidden curriculum, the rules of engagement for being a teenager in the early 1960s. And gasp, more than half of the people in this new high school were not Baptist. My difference, in other words, where I came from, felt like a liability, or some might say a stigma. I was or felt like the new other who wanted desperately to be in. I had also been other in Nigeria, but a privileged other. White, wealthy, compared to most Nigerians, in a British colony that was becoming independent. But in the part of the country where we lived, white kids and people were still a rarity back in the 1950s, an unusual other defined in a word by how we were not like their normal. Driving into a bush village on a Sunday morning to visit a church, we would be surrounded by children yelling, "Oyibo, Oyibo," meaning literally peeled one. Peel plasts of black skin, and we were all pink or white. If there had been a Nigerian questionnaire to fill out in those days about race, justly I would have had to check off being a person of color. Then later, the Institute. Oh, sorry. A college major in American Studies, a field known for exploring periods and issues in American life from the perspective of multiple disciplines, all part, I know, of now trying to figure out identity or who I was. Seminary in New York City, chosen because New York represented the place where people from all over the world had first intersected with America, at least in immigration for sure, and left their ancestral and cultural marks in pockets all over the place. A paradoxical environment where I felt both at home and in a new world, an intersection of church with both city and suburb, with field education experiences in both. To a year of clinical pastoral education in Chapel Hill, attractive because it blended my history as being the son of a doctor on a hospital compound with my call to ministry. But that call sent me as a chaplain to the Division of Disorders of Development and Learning as part of my training year, commonly called then the diddle. I had to ask my supervisor what they did there. When I was told it was a multidisciplinary evaluation and treatment center for kids with mental retardation and other disabilities and their families, using the words of those days, my first response was, that's too much of a foreign country. I can't do that. That's not my country. Send somebody else. But there, my vocation found me, most likely because of the stories I heard from families about how they had been othered by systems and society, including the church. Then to being a chaplain at one of the old hellhole institutions with 1,500 residents, where the biggest tragedy was the scarcity of intersections with others who did not live there. It was not a path, but a dead end. And where the intersection between institution and community might have done just as well have been a high wall. My first talks to churches and church groups used a familiar template from my childhood, hearing my parents talk about their work in a foreign country. Disability was a foreign world to many, though right in their own figurative and literal backyards. Even the word used to describe the rising tide of deinstitutionalization reflected migration. In New York, they were repatriating people from institution back to community, repatriating, helping people go back to where they came from, even when the community said, not in our backyard. And other intersections as my journey continued, trying to find a language with which to talk about the role of faith and spirituality in a world defined by the medical and human sciences and understandings of professionalism, or more broadly, the intersection between science and religion. Role changes from single to married, husband to father, periodic moves from north to south, south to north to south to north to south. Learning from other disciplines as well as personal successes and failures about the complexity and fun of building connections and real community between people with and without disabilities. Recognizing the depth of most intersections in that process were both an outward and recognizing that the depth of most intersections in that process were both an outward and an inward journey, where felt risk and newness uncovered strange parts of me, sometimes parts I had used to avoid seeing. I hadn't seen them, and I also used to avoid seeing other parts, especially when my journey led to two unwelcome and perilous journeys into and through the lands and labels of a major clinical depression. From Bruce Anderson, I learned some words for that our core gifts are often the reverse side of our core pain. Then later, the Institute, born with a secular grant whose goal was to help train younger generations of religious leaders in inclusive and supportive ministries and services with people with disabilities and their families. Developed as a place where people with differences of ability, faith background, role, credentials, and culture could come together to share how disability had impacted their worlds, a place where we could build capacity individually and collectively, theoretically, theologically, to increase the numbers of ways that disability intersects and connects with all the dimensions of being human and being people of faith in whatever form of belonging that takes. From the beginning, the Institute was not just about pastoral care. or religious education, but about the ways disability and inclusion can be informed by and inform all of the theological disciplines and those beyond. We've done deep dives into particular areas while having some of our most memorable presentations from people not in our usual circles, disciplines, or roles. Think, for example, of Judith Snow's presentations in 2013 and 2014. All along that journey, having experiences, revelations, encounters, and hearing from others about the ways that intersections in the world of disability led to new insights about very old truths of who we are as humans in God's world, a world in which diversity, disability, and complexity of connection were built into its very fabric of being. For me, it's been a witness to what Parker Palmer also talked about as being a modern rationale for hospitality in that conference back in Rochester. Hospitality, welcoming the stranger. He put it in a new framework with 3 reasons why it's so important. First, it's a matter of self-survival. If the world's not safe for strangers, it's not safe for me, for I am stranger to multiple others. Or stated more in the language of intersectionality, if the world's not safe for others, it's not safe for me, for I am other to multiple people. It's a healing antidote to one of the major ills of modern life, boredom. In diversity of viewpoints, experience, there's always wonder, something to be learned and enjoyed. Assumed sameness is boring. One of the examples I always use is to think about what most of us would do without the diversity of ethnic cuisines that most of us have grown accustomed to loving and enjoying, even if we can't get them at sometimes. But quoting poet Norm Paget, Parker Palmer said about the diversity and the wonder that any God who created Eskimos and elephants must have had 2 or 3 kids of his own. And third, it takes multiple perspectives to see the truth. People come with a variety of lenses by which they experience and interpret the world and deal with multiple lenses through which they are experienced and interpreted by others. But the most prominent definition of disability is that of a construct of multiple intersections, rather than being someone or something broken down on the so-called normal road. The World Health Organization. The health condition impacts body functions and structure, which then impact ability, activity, and the capacity to participate in the community and society. And is also impacted by contextual factors in that society, those of environment, such as access, architecture, attitudes, systems, policies, and culture, all of which impact how we think about disability, and personal factors. What people with disabilities, how they make meaning about all the things that have happened to them and what it means to them in their own life and experience. Note that all of those paths go in 2 directions. All of the components impact with and are impacted by others, indirectly, if not directly. It combines what are sometimes called the medical, social, and ecological models of disability. But it's also another example of trying to understand how that when we try to understand disability, a particularity helps us understand what it means to be human universally, to understand our individual uniqueness, strengths, and weaknesses, while also recognizing all of us, the multiple forces in our lives to which all of us are vulnerable and which impact who we are. The model also helps me understand the ways that disability is impacted for good or for ill by other dimensions of life that are not immediately apparent up there. We know how religion, an environmental, cultural, and personal factor, has impacted people with disability in both helpful and harmful ways. We bristle at people who say it's only harmful, but despair when we hear yet another story of a person or a family whose intersections with people or communities of faith have turned out to be fruitless or, at worst, harmful. But we've also learned how disability is impacted by poverty and wealth, or class, by housing or lack of it, violence, abuse, war and peace, employment or unemployment. You're looking at one such list, and just look at the things that are impact disability and some of the major causes, including statements I've read that poverty is a major cause of disability, as well as war being one of those major causes, and other kinds of things that impact disability and especially impact people with disabilities. But let's put some faces on those intersections. Quagti Caldon and Salomon Hamis, people I've just gotten to know a little bit in this last year, thanks to a friend of mine who is doing faith-based work in third world countries or developing countries. Quagti is in a refugee camp in Yemen because of a war. He's 7 years old, being held here by his bigger brother or father. He's swivels on hips that sort of are stable axis. He's never been okay, his dad said. He suffered from some form of neuromuscular or developmental disability. His dad doesn't know why. He was born this way. He responds to touch, loves being picked up and sitting in laps. The 3 or 4 small toys that bring Quagli joy are among the family's only possessions. A purple car with wheels, which he's holding there, a blue rubber dinosaur, and a doll that looks like it was left behind and trampled on, sentenced to a short life in the lost and found bin. He spends days with his father and an older sibling. He loves to try to play and to try to speak, but airstrikes have forced Ali and older children and their family to flee from their home. And as they search for food, Quagli is left alone, laying in the family's baking tent, unattended but for the gaze of his threadbare doll and blue dinosaurs. In Tanzania, Solomon on the right, his legs quit working when he was a child, early child, and chronic hunger meant he never had the energy to play. Now he's eating regularly. He speeds on a homemade wooden scooter across the clay in front of his small house in a small hillside in Tanzania. But what his mom wants for him is he wants that something to help him to transport himself, because as he's growing, I soon won't be able to carry him. He likes to play, but can't go to school because he just lacks the means of transportation, a wheelchair to help him get there. You've got your own faces in your communities and countries around the world, faces of people with disabilities impacted by and impacting many of those intersections. And add in all the other dimensions of human identity and how they intersect with disability rather than being separate and apart. In the world of disabilities, we often hear from people with disabilities from minority groups about how they can sometimes feel doubly marginalized by being part of that minority, but also within that minority. That's one reason I've been so grateful for new voices and leadership related to disability and faith from ethnic minorities in a white majority society, and which has been until fairly recently a white majority field of theology and disability, although that's been changing and probably at the grassroots never been that. The disability world, though, itself is not immune to a pecking order. The Institute has tried to include people and speakers representing a number of these intersections. All of this is to say is that disability is both caused and impacted by multiple dimensions of human life, or in other words, people with disabilities live at multiple intersections, including the ways that being people of faith and being part of faith communities does or does not impact, as Eric Carter would say, the other 6 days of their lives. When I began to hear and even learn more about the theories of intersectionality related to other minorities and coming from their perspective, it was for me, aha, well, of course. One of the definitions, Wikipedia. It's an analytical framework for understanding how aspects of a person's social and political identities combine to create different models of discrimination and privilege. Example of these aspects include gender, caste, sex, race, sexuality, religion, disability, physical appearance, and height. Or the Oxford Dictionary defines intersectionality as the interconnected nature of social categorizations such as race, class, gender, regarded as overlapping and interdependent forms or systems of discrimination and disadvantage. Intersectionality is the acknowledgement that everyone has their own unique experiences of discrimination and oppression, and we must consider everything and anything that can marginalize people, and the list of characteristics there as well. In the States, the biggest example of this recently has been the impact of COVID on people of color and on minorities, and the lack of effective care in so many places of prevention and of care. So this intersection becomes another way of saying that varieties of stigma and prejudice overlap with one another. When a disabled person also embodies other forms of difference from a majority or a minority, it's hard to know which barriers of attitude and expectations around them are which, and which ones compound the responses from other people to them, and which also confound a disabled person's search for identity, purpose, and community, compounding the issues in relationships and confounding the issues in relationships. The road through and around intersecting attitudes and stigmas and prejudices is not easy. I cannot say to people on that journey, I fully understand, because it is not my life, nor have I had to personally face many of the barriers in their lives. I've had my own issues, but my surface identities have usually been seen by others as assets and not barriers, certainly to a job that I might have sought, at least that I didn't know there were ever a barrier. I never felt compelled as a parent to have a teenage conversation with my son about how to handle himself with the police, nor have I been sexually mishandled by professors or bosses. I can listen, learn, be the best ally I can be, and sometimes hopefully help clear the path, all of which I hope says something about the power of faith to both call me and others and people with disabilities or other minorities themselves to a life of commitment and belief and hope and love and faith and change. The complexity and intersectionality of human suffering should not be unfamiliar to people of faith. If Christian, perhaps you grew up singing the same song I did, written by Methodist Episcopal preacher Frank Mason North in the urban jungles in the late 1800s, just before the turn of the century. I'm not going to sing it for you because that would glaringly show one of my other liabilities and limitations. But the title of the song, "Where cross the crowded ways of life, where sound the cries of race and clan, above the noise of selfish strife, we hear your voice, O Son of Man. In haunts of wretchedness and greed, on shadowed thresholds fraught with fears, from paths where hide the lures of greed, we catch the vision of your tears. From tender childhood's helplessness, from human grief and burdened toil, from famished souls, from sorrow's stress, your heart has never known recoil." There are a couple of other verses, but these get at the sense of the song. But hear that last line so clearly and cleanly. Your heart has never known recoil. But what is intersection? Is it inclusive or exclusive? For some, my purpose here is not to get into the lengthy debate about it and its cousins, critical race theory, or a critique of capitalism or more. For its critics, it's a new ideology or a new religion. Andrew Sullivan, for instance, is still the best writer I know on depression, decries its impact on campuses where those who represent the historically powerful sexes, races, or systems are seen by others or by woke others as incapable of seeing the truth. But he balances that with noting that there are forces on the other side of political and cultural spectrums that also other people who also claim that truth is what they say it is, and anything contrary is false facts. New forms of excommunication, it seems to me, are alive and well, both between and within both sides of cultural and political divides. But it does seem to me that intersectionality should seem somewhat obvious to those of us living and working in the disability arena, while also noting first, and I'm not going to go into this in detail, but noting first that disability is often left out of wider discussions about intersectionality, just like it's left out of wider discussions about diversity or cultural competence, or how faith communities deal with diversity, or other kinds of discussion that relate to the diverse world in which we live. Disability is often left out of that dialogue. But not only is disability left out, so is ability. So is ability. As a white man, I can and have tried very hard to work to avoid attitudes and actions that can be or can be seen as racist, ableist, ageist, paternalistic, etc., etc. But that work still begs the question of how I define, claim, and use my own ability and identity as a child of God to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with my God, as an individual and as a person living in, shaped by, and shaping systems of human interaction. I know that others will say their identity and ability has been oppressed by overlapping attitudes and systems of isms, racism, sexism, ableism, etc. I think the only ism that I've probably ever had to deal with you could be called clergyism. It's people who are very leery about clergy at times. I've had to hear, though, and understand that at their analysis, the people who've been impacted by those, and lament with them. People of faith should not be strangers to understanding suffering or sin or naming principalities and powers that may be responsible for both in our world, in the world in which we live. But I also want to help people see, claim, and use their gifts in the vocation and life to which they feel they've been called, and to be seen by others as much more than victim. The world of disability is still trying to get rid of the label of being victim by virtue of individual sins or parental sins. Identity seen only as deficit and defect for the oppressor or the oppressed has not gotten people with disabilities very far. Again, the question, has ability been left out of the discussion about intersectionality? Don't hear it from me, hear this from Corey Fraser, the executive director of the Pittsburgh Center for Autism Advocacy, an advocate herself, in a short piece entitled Disability and Intersectionality, Not the Default Disabled Person. Theoretically, the disabled person probably exists. After all, there are lots of us disabled folks, but they are certainly not the typical disabled person. The problems start when we realize that every system we have built for disabled people has a default disabled person in mind. Maybe not the one I've listed above, but a similar one. Once you change any variable to deviate from this default, it starts to get muddy. My friend or partner isn't a default disabled person. The system expects one dimension of difference. She should have chosen anorexia or autism or gender dysphoria, but those are not the lives we live. Instead, those of us living at the intersection of multiple identities find ourselves choosing between ableism from LGBT providers, transphobia from autism providers, and panic from providers who specialize in neither. Many of the people in our community with the same intersecting identities live their lives besieged. The programs that can get them a base level of care they need to survive also condemn them to poverty in order to maintain eligibility. I don't write this as a call for pity, but as an example of the realities of living at the intersection of multiple systems of oppression as people with disabilities. Zoe, my chosen family, and I make decisions every day to resist or comply with systems that are directly exploitative and traumatic in order to survive this world and to have our needs met. But beyond statistics, that's what intersectionality means, that we cannot understand the choices we are all forced to make every day in the context of any single system of oppression. It is all those systems working constantly and inextricably that form our experiences of oppression and trauma. And it is only through this intersectional understanding that we begin to dismantle those systems and heal. Intersectionality is usually understood as a dynamic and intersecting connections of stigmatization, devalued characteristics, i.e., some may think it's about oppression and victimhood. Most of us may be able to take one thing at a time, but get overwhelmed by the complexity. So take them one at a time and try to listen, learn, and understand. But it also not be interpreted as a dynamic and interacting connections of valued characteristics, qualities, and stories. Sure. So when overwhelmed by the complexity, take them one at a time and try to listen, learn, and understand. Sure sounds like a biblical call to me. One place to start is with ourselves, the ways our identity has been shaped with and by multiple others and systems over the course of our lives. Think of your identity as who you understand yourself to be, how you present yourself to the world, and how the world sees you, i.e., a dynamic, ongoing intersection. And parts of that identities are things we've gotten by osmosis, assumptions we take for granted, depending upon the worlds in which we lived. As my friend and co-editor of the Journal of Religion, Disability, and Health back in its early days, David Coulter, once said, as a doctor, he tried to see people with three sets of eyes. Through their own, i.e., to sit in their shoes, walk with them in their shoes, through their own, through his and other people, and then finally through God's eyes, to think about how God would see a person in front of him. John Swinton comes at this from another direction in his book on dementia, Living in the Memories of God, when he says, when people begin to lose their sense of identity, others will still know who they have been and can reflect that back to them, can hold that identity for them and reflect that back to them, as well as relating to them as we think God would have us to do, both in terms of who they identified themselves and who God sees that person who has been a child of God. Psychologist Robert KEEGAN writes about the notion of the evolving self in a book subtitled Problem and Process in Human Development. I'm not going to lay out his theory in his terms because it's pretty abstract, but rather distill it into mine in my terms to the intersections of connection and separation that shape our lives. Before we are born, we essentially, our identity is our mothers, our parents, i.e., I am you. After we're born, I am my parent, my mother, my mothers and fathers, the people, adults, right? Because I am theirs, I am theirs. And after our first intersections with the world, I'm theirs, but she's also mine. They're also mine. I own her, as many parents would feel that they also feel owned by that young child. But when we get a little bit older and then begin to realize what we can do and our independence and capacity that we can do ourselves, remember you as a child and seeing other children saying, I am me. See what I can do. I did that somersault. I did the swings. I did that math problem. See me, see what I can do. And then as we move into our teenage years, our need for connection, for identity comes front and center. And our identity is often shaped by groups or identities we claim or belong to. They're shaped by rites of transition into adulthood and faith communities. They're shaped by other forces where we essentially say, I am yours, leading, I'm part of this group, I'm part of that, in bad ways to I'm cool or I am not cool or they're not cool, but leading us in that search for identity for many of us, but not all of us, at some point towards the end of our youth, to giving of ourselves to another in a partnership or marriage, and hopefully have given a lot of ourselves to people with whom we are close friends. And then finally, as our adult self merges, we begin to claim the voice and the calling, the vocation and calling that gives life meaning and purpose to us, and which we give ourselves. And then we can say, I am, and you fill in the blank. I am Bill Gaventa. This is who I am. I am clergy person. I am husband. I am. This is kind of who I am. And later, as we grow older, not everybody, but some of us, and for me, this has certainly been true, that there's a sense of a growing sense of connection with the wider world, a la Thomas Merton, a sense that I am us. I am us, and somehow connected to those kids in Yemen and Tanzania and to others in places where I have never been. Our journey is a very squiggly dance, mostly not in straight lines, but between knowing who and whose we are, and the purposes to which we have been called. And in that journey, we lay claim to multiple identities and multiple stories, multiple limitations and multiple strengths and abilities, all of which can connect us to different communities. The graphic we used earlier at least needs arrows, as I've tried to put in here somewhat clumsily, going in both directions. And probably, as I thought about it, lines going both ways from each of those categories around the rim to each of the others. Then you'd really have a spider web. And it would illustrate something that we as individuals can often feel like when we're caught in the middle of a bunch of forces that impact us, sometimes ensnare us, and sometimes we feel like we're getting caught in the crossfires. But if you've been to the Institute a number of times or heard some of my other talks, there's a very simple and profound exercise that gets at this question of identity. It involves something you could do right now. Take out a piece of paper and write across the top, I am, and then put 10 blanks below that. Then fill in those blanks with ways you understand your identity. It could be roles, passions, hobbies, qualities, beliefs, membership, and more. The one thing you can't use in this exercise with groups is your job. Why? Because that's the only way most of us define ourselves. And we often don't, and we do have so many other parts that make up what's important to who we are. Do this with a group of any reasonable size. With larger groups, after you do it, you may want to break the group up into similar circles of 5 or 10 people. Because what you want them to do is to have members of the group share those 10 with each other. It is, in simple form, a way of getting past an introduction that is only about what you do or where you're from or where you live. If I was to fill that out, I would have things on there like father, husband, clergyman. Think probably I'd use the label recovering professional, I hope. Gardener, baseball fan, even more so soccer fan, and think lover of different kinds of foods. You would to name your own. You would have to name your own. But every time I've done so, several things happen. Characteristics in those 10 will be shared by others, and potential immediate connections are established. I.e., we find a way that our lives intersect, and that person becomes someone different than we assumed. And after the exercise is over, we might want to go and talk to them. But second, I've rarely heard anyone list something that they considered to be negative or limitation or vulnerability, such as I am a recovering alcoholic or a member of AA, or some other condition that may have that they fear may have social stigma connected to it. Unless they've been able to turn that stigma into a statement of pride as women, person in recovery, people of color, varied sexual orientations have done, as they've done in this country and other places, and sometimes in the world of disability, when people reverse a label and claim it as identity, culture, and a valued diversity, as with saying, I am deaf, or I am autistic, and to say that with pride. And you could tell stories around each of those 10 things that are important to who you are. Stories that would connect you, stories about experiences, strengths, passions that you share with one another. And then I come back over and over again to the wonderful TED Talk by Nigerian novelist Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie on the danger of a single story. All of these stories make me who I am. But to insist only on these negative stories is to flatten my experience and to overlook the many other stories that formed me. The single story creates stereotypes. And the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. And power is the ability not just to tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story of that person. So the power of wanting to claim and to say and to speak and voice your own story, you can see how that's become so important to so many people. The danger of a single story built on how a label that signifies limitation or what we might consider to be other than some other group. Each of us has the power to recognize and change the ways that that power has been used and institutionalized to make one story in people's lives the only story, even if it's one understanding, one step at a time. That's where othering begins. That's where it begins to end. But too often those stories are untrue. Too often they're used only to bolster our pride by claiming we're at least not like that. Thinking and saying who we are not still begs the question of who we are. Here, Corey Fraser again. But might intersectionality not also be interpreted as a dynamic interacting connections of valued characteristics, qualities, and stories? Might we say that we are all called to claim the identities and abilities most important to us, including, if appropriate, being a child of God and one of God's people, using those abilities to respond to our search for vocation and call that gives meaning and difference to the world in which we live, move, and have our being. And that means having enough curiosity and capacity to listen to the multiple stories in the lives of others behind the single story identity that we or our society may have placed on them. As pastoral hymnist Frank Mason North said, we're across these crowded roads of life, if our identities have been shaped or caught in the cries of race and clan, selfish strife, haunts of wretchedness and greed, shadowed thresholds fraught with fears, pains where hide the lures of greed, tender childhood's helplessness, human grief and burdened toil, famished soul and sorrow's stress. He reminds us to hear God's voice above and within that complexity, to see a vision of God's tears for the people caught in those places, and open ourselves because God's heart has never known recoil, quote unquote. Most of us might be able to take one thing at a time, but get overwhelmed by the complexity. So take them one at a time and try to listen, learn, and understand. But might it not also be interpreted as a dynamic and interacting connections of valued characteristics, qualities, and stories? Because it's really only through our mutual recognition of shared abilities, gifts, and passions and calls that truly inclusive communities are built where everyone feels that they belong. The people of the Bible and other faith traditions have always been balancing our lives between being on the move and having a home, moving out and beyond by force, choice, or response to call, often expanded the vision of who and what was in God's house. In fact, as a Christian, I've come to understand the call of Scripture and its stories as one of moving out from what we think is the center towards the margins, towards the intersections. Because, as the prophets say, that's where God will be, or you haven't paid any attention to them, or that's where Jesus says, you will find me. Why? Because to care at the margins beyond which we place all kinds of human difference and suffering, we must open ourselves to people often considered other, and thereby also opening ourselves to ourselves as well as to their stories. It's there that we often have experiences of providential revelation, perhaps in what is felt to me like some of the most holy moments in my life, places where I receive much more than I give, and where we find that God has been there all along. Many of us could tell story after story about learning at the margins, what is truly at the center of what it means to be human, to care for one another, and to be ourselves. But beyond personal transformations, that's also happened in the world of disability in a systemic or generalized view, where discoveries of the best specialized, quote unquote, or marginalized, quote unquote, supports turn out to be much more widely applicable. Think, for the example, of universal design, or positive behavior supports, or accessible structures and policies that make it easier for everyone. Remember as well what we have learned about what it truly means to be synagogue, church, or mosque, where everyone is welcome. And once again, as Eric Carter and colleagues have felt and defined what it means to belong, how what it means to belong to people with disabilities and their families is what it means to belong for everyone. Then and only then might we make it easier for people who have been marginalized to come into the circle and the center if they choose to do so, while we as a majority of any kind do the corresponding work of expanding our internal and social boundaries that have limited them and limited us and limited me. But it also means learning to look, as Bell Hooks says, from the outside in as well as the inside out. It may mean standing with those marginalized as an ally in resistance over against the power of the center, or standing with someone marginalized over the process of being invited, welcomed, known, accepted, supported, cared for, befriended, needed, loved, being present, just being present to start with, being an ally in that journey, standing with people in that journey. It may means naming and remembering what shaped an oppressive past while also, quote, remembering, re-membering people as they wish to be remembered or membered into congregations and communities as they so desire, without having to first change their identity or deny their stories in order to, as the word is used, to pass through a particular gate of identity in order to fit in. It may also mean being citizens of both the center and the margins, and help the boundaries to expand and to be more gateway than walls. So intersections. In Louisville at the corner of 4th and Walnut, in the center of the shopping district, I was suddenly overwhelmed with the realization that I loved all these people, and they were mine and I theirs. And we could not be alien to one another, even though we were total strangers. It was like waking from a dream of separateness, our separate identities, of spurious self-isolation in a special world, however we might now think that or define that world to be. The world of supposed holiness, which was for Thomas Merton, the monastery in which he lived, or could be for us the faith tradition in which we live. The sense of liberation from an illusory difference was such a relief and such a joy to me that I almost laughed out loud. I have the immense joy of being human, a member of a human race where God has embraced, as if the sorrows and stupidities of the human condition could overwhelm me, for I now realize what we all are. And if only everybody could realize this, but it cannot be explained. There's no way of telling people that they are all walking around shining like the sun. Well, Merton was wrong about one thing. I think you can tell other people that they are shining like the sun. If we listen, if we go looking for ability, capacity, passion, call, connection, go looking for the sun in each of their lives and doing what we can and as companions on their journeys to help all of these, as another gospel song says, all of these little lights of ours shine in the spaces we choose, the spaces we cross, and the faces and the spaces to which we are called. Thanks very much.
Bill, thank you. That was great. That was just really stimulating, thoughtful, and you just gave us your wisdom, and you gave us your personality, and you gave us so much of a gift. So thank you very much for that. There's some really interesting questions that people have given to us. If you're up for that,
sure.
Good.
I learned as a chaplain doing worship services in a facility for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, that if you get up to lead something in worship, you better expect feedback, whether you want it or not. So
that's true. Yeah. And I imagine that would be the same for Jesus.
Yeah.
So the first question is an interesting one. It's kind of like about the whole idea of disability. And the question is, I wonder about the continued use of disability as a term for other people. Is there, likewise for the term differently able, do we need to find a new language that doesn't necessarily include the language of disability as we know it?
Well, I think that's a thing that lots of us battle around lots of times. And lots of times I think people say, and people like me and other people have said to me, we shouldn't even talk about using other. But there is difference in the world, lots of different kinds of differences. Part of it is the value question we place upon those differences. I don't want to be like everybody else. I don't want everybody else to be like me.
Yeah. And
my route out of that is asking people with disabilities, and both individually and collectively, what term do you want to use? I mean, I want to get to know you, say you, John Swinton, as person, as as professor, as family migrant to UK, as for all your, as musician, which people don't know you as person with good sense of humor, all those kinds of things, so that one definition about how you're, quote, different is not the single story. Yeah. And I think, and what I hear from people with disabilities is trying to euphemize that, not euphemize, euphemize, not euthanize. That may feel, labels may feel like euthanizing, can lead there, but euphemize it by saying things like differently abled or whatever. Most people don't like that. So how do we find new language, and how do we find each other in the course of looking for that language, and thereby find each other and get to know each other?
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's great. And I really like the way that you really opened up human identity. I was listening to, I had a conversation actually the other day with a psychologist called Stephen Sabat, and he was talking about stigma in the context of dementia. He said something similar to you. He said, imagine taking a piece of paper and writing down everything that you don't like about yourself, and then everybody talking about that forever, ever and more. In other words, every negative trait that you think about yourself, every negative trait that everybody else thinks about you becomes your identity. Yeah. How would that feel? You hit that in the nail by just giving us our roles.
Well, it's what Hans Reinders and others people are doing, and people around are doing is, how would you like to be introduced by your doctor's notes on you, or by my therapist's notes? How would you? And that gets back in. I didn't have time to study it, but you all see me sometimes in other places play around. I do it in the book with the word, what assessment means. That the Latin word for that, the Latin root to that word is to sit next to. Yeah. And yet it's only in sort of modern times as we thought of assessment as something objective, something that we can name and stand apart from, and thereby not seeing the person, know what's there. Well, it can help us know some of what's there, like a label often gives relief to parents or people who are struggling with different kinds of issues. But by golly, you better get to know the person that's interacting with that label, or otherwise, it's just an illusion.
Yeah. I mean, I'd quite like you to introduce yourself to me with your therapist notes. I think I'd find that very interesting. But we'll think about that.
Well, the only time we ever do like that, go with that exercise with the 10, talking about 10 capacities of who we are. The only time we ever usually share things that we think might be seen critically by other people is when we've gone to something that's definitely meant to be a support group, or a prayer group, not an everyday meeting group, and we go to church singing "Just as I Am," but we don't really put out "Just as We Are."
That's a good illustration. So the next question, Bill, is an interesting one. It's on intersectionality, and I'll just read it. Bill, You have always offered hope and space for the kinds of cross-intersectional conversation and encounters that sometimes seem difficult and complex, which is absolutely true, of course. Where else do you see these hopeful spaces emerging, or who are the people who are doing a good job of making these spaces possible?
Well, you remember, I got several things going on in my head about that. I mean, I keep running into over and over again now, at least people here in the States, trying to figure out new ways for us to talk past divisions and move back towards some kind of civility, at least in our communities. And those in some ways have just begun. We've got a long ways to go, but a lot of people are trying to do that. The person I quoted who impacted me so greatly early on, 30 years ago, Parker Palmer, is, done this, his Center for Courage and for Hope and Renewal has been trying to do that for a while, about, healing democracy by, first of all, recognizing diversity and learning how to talk with each other, and not to impose labels or to assume that labels define people. But you also remember some of the ways in which I think, and this it's been my experience over and over again, and it got highlighted by you and Stan Hauerwas and Jean Vanier and others about how it is that people with disabilities may bring people from other differences together who wouldn't usually be around each other, and who in fact be, in one of the words that was used in some writings was might help to be peacemakers. Because you get into a space there where then people, maybe we're recognizing that our limitations, that all of us have limitations, and that all of our labels, have some inadequacy, and they're ours and not God's, so to speak. So I think hopefully you've got those spaces. It's, I see them in different ways. I see people trying to, and I try to intentionally try to do that with people, sometimes even on Facebook, although sometimes I get caught up in responding to people, especially some of my Texas Congress people, senators, in ways that are not particularly leading to dialogue, but I try to respond at times to ways that I hope they will.
Yeah. So, I mean, have you come across any areas of good practice or examples of intersectionality in action that you think would be helpful for people?
I just think there's so many out there. I mean, I think there are ways in which faith communities that have tried to become honest reflections of the communities in which they are sometimes, and welcome people. I just read one really powerful book. I don't know, John, if you've read it yet. And I did a review for it, but one really powerful book that I would really recommend to everybody. And also coming out of Atlanta, just like The Disabled God came out of Atlanta. This one's by Rebecca Spurrier, called The Disabled Church, written about from her PhD about a church in Atlanta in which an Episcopal church that tried to start relating to its neighborhood as people moved out, and essentially has become a home and hospice and sanctuary for people with and without mental illness and all other kinds of intersecting identities, sexual, racial, cultural, class, students, those in recovery, those not. And it's just a fascinating exploration about how a faith community there has to look at everything it does and as a way of building connections and relationships, and not coming to a faith community assuming because of tradition or rituals or the way things have been done, that those ways of relating are already set up and are thus the hidden curriculum that people might not fit into.
That's brilliant. And I'm just seeing that Talitha Kurman has put in the chat the book's by Rebecca Spurrier, and you have a review coming out of it, and I think in the next journal of the religion.
Yeah, the next journal. Yep.
Yep. So that's great. That's brilliant.
And she was Rebecca's done a couple things at the Institute. We went, some of us went to there, I think at the Institute in Atlanta, to that community. And the brave thing that she's done is the label that is the title of the church, the Disabled Church, because as a sense, a kind of not a counterpoint, but a follow-up from Nancy Easland's book, and really looking about what in this day a disabled church might look like, that really takes seriously the notion of disability.
That's right. I remember visiting there with you, and I remember having that conversation with her. I just didn't put the two together. That's brilliant. A couple of really interesting questions in and around the area of peacemaking and change. So what do we do when intersectionality causes exclusion and inattentions? So, for example, recent high-profile disputes between feminists and trans people. How do we negotiate and bring peace into that complicated situation?
Well, if I knew, I could probably become really wealthy, become the highest paid consultant of all times. But
I'd be your partner.
I think, I just bring you with me, John, and say, hey, if the two of us can get along, then come on. But there's a very funny story, but we don't have time for it. Maybe we will, about when I first met John. But anyway, I think the thing is, you've got to get not everybody who's doing that kind of fighting there are a lot of non-vocal people who feel differently, who are also in those arenas. There are people who feel like there's a broader story, and people who are not necessarily comfortable with duking it out or recognize. And I think we've got to be able to claim some kind of middle ground and recognize all the stuff about intersectionality is one of the things that I've learned over years about dealing with disability. And then I learned about dealing with my own in terms of a depression. Is the first thing one of the things you've got to do is do your own internal search, and recognize and critique, maybe even learn to laugh at the parts of you that come out at times when you say, oh, there I go again, or they're my childhood habit appeared once again. And again, it goes back to this thing about a single story. People are not just single stories. And if I wonder if people, okay, I just got a response recently the other day from a chapter that Devon Stahl and Kate McDonald and I wrote about disability and ethics, using a justice view in a book on public health, or for an ethics chapter in a book on public health. And I got a response by someone a rehab counselor who's writing her own article about intersectionality and disability. And she wanted to see if I knew that there were differences between disability rights, disability studies, and disability justice. In other words, if I knew there were differences between three different camps of people who are saying, wait a minute, we're better than the disability rights people because we're more focused on not just rights, but on getting justice. And we're not like the disability studies people because we're more focused on action than we are on study. and that just, that again, just gets into this thing about you're building up your sense of rightness by putting somebody else down.
Yeah.
And it's cowardly.
Mhm.
I mean, in the long run, it's cowardly, because you've got to be able to claim, we've got to be able to claim who we are and all the, and I asked her, one of the things I asked her in response was, do you think the people in each of those three areas of disability studies or action would accept the differentiations that the other areas are making about each other?
Mhm.
And I would bet not. I bet you people, lots of them, consider themselves in all three.
Yeah, that's a good answer, Bill. Thank you. It's a complicated issue.
Yeah.
The next question relates to change. So move from peacemaking to change. What kinds of challenges are posed for organizations and supports when people's ways of self-identifying shift over time? And I suppose an example of that might be something like the way in which Asperger's syndrome has been moved into the broader category of autism, which makes it difficult to be a person with Asperger's, because formally that diagnosis or that language didn't exist.
Well, I think you see a number of organizations in the disability arena trying to figure this out. I mean, if you talk about self-advocacy and self-determination, then do the people we support really get to control the language that we use about them, or you know, in themselves, or at least change the ways, you know, how do we get programs or whatever to support lives rather than lives being part of programs? What gets priority, and how things get seen. I could tell you from a project that I'm working on, some of you know about it, and hopefully to be launched later in the fall, but the Hospice Foundation of America, along with the funded by the Nancy Lucy Marks Foundation in Boston, is in the process of developing a website on grief, loss, and end-of-life issues for people, for adults who are autistic. And the process of working on that, some of the biggest questions have been, how do we make sure, and wrestling is, how do we make sure that this can be understood or appreciated by people at many different places on the spectrum? And how do we be incredibly careful about language? And how do we make sure we've got the voices of people with autism or Asperger's themselves telling their own stories? And it's going to be, I think, a really good resource. But when it launches, you know, what's going to happen? We're going to learn things that, you know, we didn't get quite right. But that's the beauty of the project, because it's going to be ongoing for several years, and we can make changes. They can make changes as it goes along. But I mean, what's exciting to me about that, though, is you're getting a area related to grief, loss, and end-of-life issues for people with autism or developmental disabilities into the mainstream of, quote, the Hospice Foundation of America and all the ways it deals with grief and loss. So you're not just trying to take some other models about grief and loss and understanding and impose it on somebody else, And like, for instance, you know, providing, it doesn't help a lot to use some kind of euphemistic phrase about somebody's death to a person who's autistic, who may see terms very literally.
Sure. Great. So we have a couple more questions, and we're moving towards the end of our time together. But this is a helpful question. Are there disabled thinkers and writers that are particularly impactful on your work and thinking?
Say that again. Are there disabled thinkers and writers?
Are there disabled thinkers and writers that are particularly impactful on your work and thinking?
Oh, well, Nancy Easland was one. Other people who've written about disability, shared their stories. I've have to look at a bunch of the books on my shelf. I will also say, and you know this, I am less of the academic that's read everything than the person who's tried to talk to everybody, and been at a lot of places and intersections where I could help hear people's stories, either families or individuals with disabilities or other. So a lot of those may not have been at all ever written up into any single thing that I could point you to in some ways. I think getting into places where those conversations are going on, there's a young man, named Cal Montgomery, who's on Facebook, who is a person on the autism spectrum, who's one of the best writers I know, but who's also had a terrible time because of healthcare issues around disability and sexual identity and so on. But boy, in terms of articulate about language, and some of the other people from the spectrum that I've read, in terms of that kind of articulation, and people with cerebral palsy, people with mental illness. I mean, Andrew Sullivan, who I mentioned, wrote about his own mental illness and the Noonday Demon, and that was why I think one of the places where I most felt connected to somebody else who'd gone on that journey.
Great. I think that's absolutely. The reason I'm looking away is not because you're boring me, Bill. It's because I've got two screens here, and new questions are coming in over here, and I've got a screen here where other questions are coming in. So that's
what you get for being such a renowned professor, is you get all these questions.
Well,
John.
So you get for being so interesting. But there's an interesting conversation here that I've been asked to pass on to you. Okay, so it's a little bit of backwards and forwards here, which I think would be helpful. So I won't name the people involved in case they don't want to be named. But one person said, when we were talking about the three groups earlier on in terms of intersectionality, I think it's a gross mischaracterization of the differences between these three groups. I think disability justice is especially important right now, especially as intersectionality is one of their guiding principles. I strongly encourage people to look into the differences themselves. The first response was, my experience of the three groups has been definitional, not better than. The definitions have been about distinguishing their work from other work in the disability team. And then the third person there says, my faith and activism go hand in hand, so there's no distinction for me. And it goes on a little bit after that, but that's the kind of conversation that you've stimulated in people's thinking here. I just wondered whether you wanted to respond in any way to that. I
think that's the kind of conversation we need to have. Is people's definitions and ways of knowing and understanding, if they're writing about it and talking about that, they may not mean it to be better than, but as well as I do, in the academic world, there's plenty of competition. Whose paper is going to be accepted, or whose talk is going to be accepted, or by golly, so it's, I think we're complex, but that's the kind of conversation we need to have. And I loved all three of those kind of responses.
Yeah, that's great. So one more question, Bill, and I'm going to hand you back to Kathy. And that's to do with that quotation that you opened and closed from Thomas Merton, because I think it's a fantastic quotation, and I'd love to have that revelation. And sometimes I kind of do have that revelation, but some people you look at and it's more easy to love than other people. But Merton's point is that you're wrong to do that. You need to love. So the essence of what you talked about tonight really is love, and how we can come about to love each other. How do we do that?
One person at a time, John.
Very good.
Yeah, one person at a time, with the understanding that hopefully with the sense of gift that we have been loved and would like to share that with other people, and look forward to finding love from others, as well as potentially finding disagreement or differences.
That's brilliant. So make the change yourself, and then that small change can bring about all sorts.
Well, I should do that confessional story real quickly. When I first met John, I had read him. We talked on the phone, and I was in London, and he got invited down by the Learning Disabilities Association into London for us to have a meeting and talk about what we were doing in our respective countries. And I was there first, and John walked in his classic t-shirt and looking a little less white-haired than he is now.
That's true.
And literally my jaw dropped because I was expecting this Scottish white professor wearing a herringbone suit. And he caught that jaw drop, and it became a source of, but that's happened to me in other ways too around, during and probably happened to most of us, where we all of a sudden realize, whoop, wait a minute, what were we assuming?
Yeah, that's very good. I suppose my incredible good looks would have struck you as significant as well. You didn't mention that, I noticed.
It took me a while to get used to those, John.
Yeah, I'm hurt. Well, thanks very much. I'm going to pass you back to Kathy. Kathy, if you're there, the floor is yours.
Of course, I'm here, and thank you, John and Bill, for that conversation and for the conversation that continues here. Bill, thank you for what you've shared today and in all of the years at the Institute. Obviously, the Institute would not be what it is without you, and you certainly continue to embody the kind of spirit that we hope ITD will continue to carry on. So as we close out, we hope that all of you will continue to stay up to date on our Institute webpage and social media accounts, which Keith is adding to the chat. Thanks, Keith. Part of that is want to point to more virtual opportunities coming up soon, including the next PhD seminar for PhD students with Dr. Sarah Barton and Dr. Devin Stahl next Tuesday already, May 25th at 12 EST, and for an author talk and mutual interview then on September 15th with Dr. Keith Dow and Dr. Brian Brock. Information about all of those things will continue on our chat and in our accounts. And stay tuned for additional virtual community gatherings as we try to figure out ways to stay in touch well during these strange months. It was good to even know that we were all in the same virtual space today. So once more, thanks for being with us, and be well, friends. Bye.
Thank you, interpreters.